The letter hit the table between them like a gunshot. Louise Grayson stared at it, her hands trembling so badly she had to press them flat against the rough-hewn wood to keep herself from shaking apart entirely. The ink was smeared in places, the handwriting unfamiliar, but the words God, the words, she had read them 3 times already and they still didn't make sense. They still felt like a brand pressed against the softest part of her chest. You knew. Her voice came out barely above a whisper, which was worse somehow than if she had screamed it. You knew this whole time and you said nothing. Harlan Keller stood across the kitchen, his hat in his hands, turning the brim over and over in that way he did when he was working through something difficult. The morning light from the single window caught the angles of his face, the strong jaw, the lines around his eyes that came from years of squinting into a brutal sun. And Louise hated, desperately and completely, how much she still wanted to go to him. How much some foolish part of her still trusted the man who had, by all evidence in that letter, been carrying a secret that could unravel everything she thought she had built. Louise, do not. The word came out sharp, final. Do not speak my name like that, not right now. The letter said that Harlan Keller had been paid, that a man named Cletus Bourne had written to a colleague back in Missouri, bragging about how he had hired the rancher out of Red Creek, Texas, to keep Louise Grayson on his property, isolated, unaware, until Bourne could ride out himself and collect what she owed him. The letter said Harlan had taken money for this. The letter said she was a trap, and she had walked right into it. Except, and here was the thing that made the floor feel unsteady beneath her boots, she had never asked for any of it. She had never asked Harlan for the dried wildflowers he left on the windowsill that first week, or the new pair of leather gloves she found on the porch steps 3 days after she arrived, her old ones worn through. She had never asked for the book of poetry he rode 14 miles to Dalton Creek to purchase, because she had mentioned, once briefly, that she used to read poetry with her mother before her mother died. She had never asked for any of the 100 small and impossible kindnesses that had, over the course of 3 months, quietly dismantled every wall she had ever built around herself. And now she was standing in his kitchen holding a letter that said it was all a lie, and her heart was doing something she couldn't name, something that felt very much like grief. "Give me a chance to explain," Harlan said quietly. Louise looked up at him. His eyes were steady, dark, and she searched them the way a person searches for solid ground in floodwater. "Then explain," she said, "and God help you if you lie to me." She had not always been this careful with people. There was a time, she was young then, newly arrived in San Antonio from Ohio with her father's old carpentry tools in a trunk, and the naive conviction that hard work was all anyone needed, when Louise Grayson had trusted the world at its face value. She had a smile then that people commented on, something open and warm, and she had given it freely. That was before the winter of 1879, when her father died of a fever that moved through their small homestead like a fire through dry grass, burning everything down. That was before the debts became visible, before men like Cletus Bourne appeared at the door with documents and cold eyes. She was 24 when she buried her father in the hard Texas ground. 24 when she discovered that the land the Graysons had worked for 11 years had been put up as collateral against a loan she had not known existed. 24 when she realized that everything she believed to be solid was in fact suspended over an enormous emptiness. She had packed what she could carry in a single canvas bag and she had left. She made it as far as Red Creek, Texas, before the money ran out. It was a small town, one main street, a general store that also served as the post office, a saloon that was only marginally less reputable than its name suggested, and a church whose white paint was peeling badly on the south-facing wall. She arrived in late October of 1880, on a wagon she had hitched a ride on from Dalton Creek, and she stood in the middle of the main street with her bag at her feet and her jaw set, and no plan at all. The woman who ran the boarding house was named Edna Pruitt. She was broad-shouldered, silver-haired, and she had a way of looking at people that suggested she had seen everything twice already and was not particularly impressed. She looked at Louise for a long moment, taking in the worn boots, the canvas bag, the particular quality of Louise's stillness that telegraphed nothing, because Louise had learned that the fastest way to be preyed upon was to let people see what you needed. "Can cook?" Edna asked. "Yes," Louise said. "Can you clean?" "Yes." "You got anywhere else to be?" "No," Edna nodded slowly. "Room and board in exchange for helping in the kitchen and the laundry. $1 a week if the work is good." Louise had taken it without negotiation, without gratitude displayed too obviously, because she had learned that showing too much gratitude made people feel powerful over you. She did not know, in those first days in Red Creek, that the tall rancher who came in twice a week for Edna's supper specials was watching her with an intensity that he himself seemed barely aware of. Harlan Keller owned the K-Bar Ranch 3 miles east of town, a modest spread by Texas standards, 400 acres of decent grazing land, a respectable herd, a barn that was better built than his house, and a reputation in town for being the kind of man who didn't say much but meant everything he said. He was 31 years old, had come out to Red Creek from Tennessee at the age of 19, and had built his ranch largely alone. The men in town liked him for his reliability. The women in town had, at various points, made clear they liked him for other reasons as well, though he had remained, through all of it, conspicuously unattached. He came into Edna's dining room on Louise's third day in Red Creek and sat down at his usual table by the window, and Louise, who was carrying a platter of biscuits, walked past him without looking at him the way she walked past everyone in those days, present, efficient, invisible by choice. "Excuse me," he said. She stopped, looked at him. He was looking up at her with a kind of directness that was different from the looks she usually received, which tended to be either calculating or inappropriately familiar. His look was simply attentive, interested in a way that seemed improbably to be about her rather than about what she might be able to provide. "You dropped this," he said, and held out a folded piece of paper. Louise looked at it. It was a letter she had written to herself, a habit she had developed, a way of keeping her thoughts organized, of arguing through decisions on paper so she didn't have to carry them all in her head. She didn't even remember it falling from her apron pocket. She took it back without a word, tucked it away, and continued to the table across the room. She didn't look at him again that evening. But she was aware, with a precise and uncomfortable awareness, of every moment that he remained in the room. His name she learned from Edna that night, washing dishes after supper. "Harlan Keller," Edna said, drying a plate with practiced efficiency. "Good man, quieter than most. Lost his brother 2 years back, fever, same as what's been moving through these parts. Tends to keep to himself since then." Louise did not ask more. She filed the information away with the same care she filed everything, cataloged it and kept it at a safe distance, and went to bed. The next time she saw him was at the general store 4 days later, where she had gone to purchase thread. He was there buying supplies: flour, salt, a new length of rope, and he stepped aside when he saw her at the counter, letting her go first even though he had been there longer. And when she thanked him, he just nodded once and went back to studying the shelf of dry goods with the same quiet attention he seemed to bring to everything. It was the first week of November when the temperature dropped suddenly, dramatically, the way it could in that part of Texas, not as severe as a northern winter, but enough to make the thin walls of the boarding house feel very thin. Louise woke one morning and found, hanging on the peg beside her door where her coat lived, a second, heavier coat. It was not new, it was well-worn good wool, the kind of coat that had been loved and taken care of, and there was no note. She brought it to Edna. "Where did this come from?" Edna looked at the coat. Her expression was carefully neutral. "Someone must have left it. Someone. It gets cold out here, Louise. People look after each other." It was not, Louise noted, an answer, but she wore the coat because she was practical above all things, and because the cold was real and the coat was warm. She did not put it together for another week. Not until she saw Harlan Keller at Edna's table and noticed that the coat he was wearing, the one draped over the back of his chair, was thinner than the weather warranted. Not until she caught herself thinking about that, and then caught herself thinking about the fact that she was thinking about it, and felt the first alarm bell ring somewhere deep in her chest. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself she was imagining connections that didn't exist, that she was the kind of woman who read too much into things because she had spent too many years in situations where missing a detail had consequences. She told herself to be sensible, but then came the book of poetry. She had mentioned her mother once in passing to Edna, who had asked what Louise missed about Ohio. It had been a brief answer that her mother used to read poetry aloud in the evenings, Tennyson mostly, and that the sound of it had made their small house in Columbus feel larger than it was. Louise had not elaborated. She had redirected the conversation the moment she felt the sentiment becoming visible. 3 days later, a copy of Tennyson's collected works appeared on the windowsill of her room. No note. The spine was barely cracked. It was a new purchase, or nearly new. And when Louise asked Edna about it, Edna said she wasn't sure how it had gotten there, but she said it in a way that suggested she knew exactly how it had gotten there. Louise stood by that window for a long time, holding the book, and felt something shift inside her that she did not have a name for, and that frightened her considerably. She went to Harlan Keller directly. She found him at Edna's that evening at his usual table, and she sat down across from him without being invited, which made him look up from his coffee with mild surprise. "The coat," she said. He looked at her steadily, said nothing. "The book," she said, a very slight shift in his expression. "Not guilt, something more complicated than guilt." "I didn't ask for those things," Louise said. "No," he agreed. "You didn't." "Then why?" He was quiet for a moment. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and looked at them, then looked back at her, and there was something in his face that she recognized, though she didn't want to. It was the look of a person who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and was deciding, very carefully, how much of it to set down. "You looked cold," he said finally, "and you looked like somebody who reads. That's not an answer. It's the truest one I've got right now." Louise sat there across from him and studied his face and wanted very badly to stand up and walk away, because staying felt dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with physical safety and everything to do with the particular vulnerability of beginning to trust someone new. She stayed. "I don't accept charity," she told him. "It isn't charity." "Then what is it?" He met her eyes and something passed between them, not quite words, not quite understanding, but the early outline of both. "Attention," he said quietly, "to the things that matter." She left shortly after, without giving him anything in return except her name, which he used once at the door, saying it the way people say words they have been thinking about privately for longer than they will admit. "Good evening, Miss Grayson." She did not sleep well that night. The days that followed carried the tension of two people circling something they hadn't named yet. Louise went about her work at the boarding house with her usual precision, the cooking, the cleaning, the management of Edna's accounts, which Edna had, without making a formal proposal, simply handed over to Louise when she realized Louise had a sharper head for numbers than anyone else in Red Creek. Louise did not ask for that responsibility. She simply saw the disorder in the ledger and began quietly setting it right, and Edna, who was many things but never foolish, had recognized what she had and let her run with it. Harlan continued to appear at Edna's twice a week, and the gifts, she had begun to call them gifts in her own mind, which was already a concession she hadn't meant to make, continued to arrive. A set of darning needles, because she had seen her struggling to thread the ones she had whose eyes were worn smooth. A length of good, dark wool fabric, because she had seen her eyeing it in the general store window. A jar of the particular type of apple preserves that she had mentioned once were her father's favorite, which he had obtained from a woman 2 towns over who made them from a specific variety of apple, and which Louise had not expected anyone to remember, let alone act on. Each gift arrived without ceremony, without expectation, without any apparent desire for credit. She would find them on the windowsill, on the porch, occasionally slipped inside the screen door while she was busy elsewhere. He never watched to see her receive them. He never brought them up in conversation. When she thanked him, and she did begin to thank him, because she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge where they were coming from, he would nod once and redirect the conversation to something neutral. It was the opposite of every transaction she had ever experienced from men who gave things. Every man who had ever given Louise Grayson something had given it as a down payment on something else, as a claim, as a way of making her feel the weight of an obligation she hadn't agreed to carry. Harlan gave things and then, impossibly, let them go. Placed them in her hands and released them entirely, as if the giving itself were the complete action and no return was either expected or desired. She did not know what to do with this. It made her careful in ways she hadn't been careful before, because she was not accustomed to the particular kind of danger that arrives in the form of unexpected decency. In December, there was a cold snap that froze the water in the pump behind the boarding house and cracked two of the windows on the east side, and Edna's rheumatism flared up badly enough that she couldn't manage the stairs. Louise ran the boarding house alone for 4 days, cooking for 8 guests, managing the fires, hauling wood from the pile at the side of the house until her shoulders ached in a way that kept her awake at night. She didn't say anything about it. She didn't ask anyone for help, because asking meant owing and owing meant vulnerability, and vulnerability was something she had systematically excised from her life like cutting away a bruised part of fruit. On the second day of this, Harlan arrived at 6 in the morning with 2 of his ranch hands and a week's worth of split firewood, which they stacked neatly against the side of the boarding house without being asked or instructed. He himself repaired the cracked windows. He had brought the glass, had measured it correctly, which meant he had assessed the situation ahead of time without making her feel assessed. And when it was done, he came in, sat at his usual table, and accepted the coffee Louise brought him without making anything of it. "You should have asked," he said when the ranch hands had gone and they were briefly, unexpectedly alone in the dining room. "I didn't need. You were hauling wood alone in the cold. You needed the help." He said it without judgment, simply as a fact. "I manage," Louise said. The words came out stiffer than she intended. He looked at her for a long moment. "I know you do," he said, and there was something in it that was not pity and not admiration exactly, but something in between, a recognition that managed to make her feel seen without making her feel exposed. Harlan. She used his first name for the first time without thinking about it, and the unexpectedness of it seemed to register on his face, a slight softening around the eyes. "Why are you doing all of this?" He was quiet for the space of several heartbeats. Through the repaired windows, the winter light came in clean and sharp. "Because somebody should," he said finally. "And because I want to." She stared at him. Turned that over in her mind, looking at it from every angle, searching for the hidden motive the way she always searched for hidden motives, because in her experience they were always there. She couldn't find one. That frightened her more than anything else had. Christmas came and went. Louise spent it at the boarding house because she had nowhere else to go, and she told herself this was fine. She had spent Christmases alone before. She was accustomed to her own company. She did not need the weight of celebration. Edna made a turkey and invited the few guests who had remained through the holiday, and it was pleasant enough. Ordinary, fine. On the morning of Christmas Day, she found on her windowsill a small carved box, made of cedar, the smell of it clean and sharp in the winter air. The carving on the lid was intricate, a flowering vine that curled around the edges with more care than she would have expected from the rough, working hands she had observed on Harlan Keller. She opened it and found inside, wrapped in a piece of cloth, a small compass. She held it in her palm, watched the needle settle, trembling to north. She understood why he had chosen it. She was a woman who had left everything she knew and gone in a direction she had not planned. A compass said, "You can always find where you are." A compass said, "There is always a direction, even when everything feels uncertain. She sat on the edge of her bed and held it for a very long time, and when she finally put it in the box and the box on the shelf above her bed, her jaw was tight in the way it got when she was working hard not to feel something she had no defenses against. She went downstairs to help with Christmas dinner, and she did not see Harlan until 2 days later, and when she did, she said, quietly and directly, "The compass." He nodded. "It was the right thing," she said. The words cost her something. She was not accustomed to admitting when someone had understood her correctly. He looked at her the way he was beginning to look at her in these moments, with that steady, unhurried attention that she was starting to understand, was simply how he was made. "I hoped it might be," he said. January arrived with a violence that February usually reserved for itself, a series of brutal storms that kept everyone close to shelter and made the roads between Red Creek and the surrounding ranches treacherous. Harlan couldn't make it into Edna's for 10 days, and Louise noticed the absence in a way that she noted with alarm, and then set about ignoring with a discipline she brought to bear on the project like a woman clearing rocks from a field. She kept herself busy. She reorganized the boarding house kitchen entirely, which Edna allowed with the gracious bemusement of someone watching a force of nature do something useful. She taught herself to use a better method of bookkeeping that she had read about in a newspaper, and she applied it to Edna's accounts, and the accounts improved immediately. She was useful. She was effective. She was, by every measurable standard, fine. She was not fine. On the 11th day, Harlan appeared at the door in the morning, his coat covered with the remnants of road mud and his expression carrying the particular alertness of a man who had worked hard to be somewhere and arrived to find everything more or less as he had expected to find it. He looked at Louise across the threshold, and something in his face released, a tension she hadn't known was there until it was gone. "Storms kept me," he said. "I know," she said. "The road from the eastern spreads has been impassable," he nodded. He was still standing in the doorway, still looking at her. "Come in," she said. "Coffee's hot." And he did, and they sat at his usual table, and the conversation they had that morning was different from the conversations that had come before. It moved differently, less careful, less measured. They talked about books, because she had been reading the Tennyson and had opinions about it that she hadn't realized she wanted to share until she was sharing them. He listened in the way that people who have genuinely interesting inner lives listen, not waiting for a pause to insert themselves, but actually following, actually engaged. He had read, he told her, more than she might expect. His mother had been a school teacher and had raised him with a conviction about the importance of books that had stuck. He named authors she hadn't expected: Dickens, Hugo, a surprising fondness for the essays of Ralph Waldo Emerson. "Emerson," Louise repeated, and she heard the note of surprise in her own voice before she could temper it. "Does that seem unlikely?" he asked, and there was a trace of dry humor in it that she had not heard from him before. "A little," she admitted honestly. "Most things about a person seem unlikely until you know them," he said. She looked at him across the table. Something in her chest tightened and then, very slowly, expanded, the way a fist unclenches. "Harlan," she said, and it was easier this time, his name in her mouth, the way a path gets easier the second time you walk it. "What is it that you want from me, from this?" He didn't deflect. He didn't perform casualness or retreat into vagueness. He met her eyes and he said simply, "To know you better, to see if what I think is between us is what I think it is." "And what do you think it is?" "Something I haven't felt before." He paused. "Something I don't want to rush or mishandle." She looked at him for a long time, feeling, beneath the old careful wariness, something new and frightening and extraordinarily, stubbornly alive. "I should tell you," she said finally, "that I am not easy to know. I'm aware of this. I've been told." "I don't need easy," he said. "I need real." She thought about her father, who had been the most real person she had ever known and whose reality had not protected him from debt or from fever or from the hard ground of a Texas winter. She thought about all the ways that being real had cost her things. "Give me time," she said. "I've got time," he told her, and he meant it in the way he always meant what he said, completely, without reservation, as a statement of simple and durable fact. February was warmer than January had been, and something between them warmed with the weather. Not rapidly. Louise did not do anything rapidly where her heart was concerned, but with a kind of steady, quiet inevitability that she tracked with something between dread and hope. He brought her things still, but they evolved. Less about physical comfort, more about her. A map of the Ohio River Valley, because she had mentioned once what her childhood landscape had looked like. A packet of wildflower seeds, because she had commented on the bare patch of ground beside the boarding house front steps and said it seemed a shame that nothing grew there. A notebook with good quality paper, because she had filled the cheap one she was using and had been writing on the margins. Each thing arrived with the same absence of ceremony, the same refusal to position himself as the architect of her gratitude, and each thing reached her in a place that was becoming progressively harder to protect. March brought the letter from Cletus Bourne. She didn't see it as a threat at first. It arrived through the post, addressed to Louise Grayson, care of Edna's boarding house, Red Creek, Texas, and it was written in the measured, legalistic language of a man who considered himself reasonable. It informed her that the debt left by her father, which had been sold to Bourne by the original lender, was still outstanding and accruing interest, and that Bourne intended to pursue collection. It said he would be traveling to Red Creek in the spring. She read it twice, put it in the drawer beside her bed, and did not sleep for 3 nights. She did not tell Harlan. She did not tell Edna. She processed it alone, the way she had always processed difficult things, running the numbers in her head, calculating what she had against what was owed, arriving repeatedly at the same answer, which was insufficient. What she did not know, what she could not have known from the inside of her own carefully maintained solitude, was that Cletus Bourne had, in fact, already been to Red Creek once before, in October, looking for her, and that he had met Harlan Keller, because Harlan Keller was the kind of man everyone in a small town directed questions toward, and that Bourne had made a proposal. He had offered Harlan money. She would later learn the sum was $200, an enormous figure, to keep Louise Grayson in Red Creek, unaware, until Bourne returned in spring with the proper legal documentation to enforce the debt. He framed it as a community service, as preventing a young woman from fleeing her legal obligations. He made it sound administrative and reasonable. Harlan had looked at the man across the Red Creek Hotel dining room and said nothing for a long time. Long enough that Bourne began to think he was being persuaded. Then Harlan had stood up, settled his hat on his head, and said with the absolute quiet of a man who has made a decision he will not revisit, "I won't take your money. And I'd advise you not to come back to Red Creek until you've got something better than a vulture's claim to offer." Bourne had left. And he had written a letter back to his business associate in Missouri about the encounter, a boastful letter, a letter full of his own wounded pride, a letter in which he claimed, with the distortion of a man rationalizing his humiliation, that he had in fact arranged a deal with the rancher, that the rancher was working for him, that Louise Grayson was being held in place by a man she didn't know was paid to keep her there. This letter, a lie, a fabrication built from Bourne's outrage and self-importance, had been forwarded by mistake to Louise Grayson herself, addressed to an associate who apparently shared her name, opened and read and sitting now on the kitchen table between them like a detonation. "He tried to bribe me," Harlan said. His voice was steady. Not defensive, deliberate, the voice of a man laying facts down carefully, making sure they land right. "In October, before I knew you. He offered me $200 to make sure you stayed in town so he could collect on a debt." Louise watched him, did not speak. "I told him no. I sent him away. I didn't tell you because," here he paused and she watched him work through it, watched him decide on honesty over strategy. "Because I didn't think it would help you to know you were being hunted, and because by the time I had any reason to think you needed to know, I cared enough about you that I was afraid of how it would look." "It looks like you kept a secret," she said. It was a secret that protected you. I know how that sounds. He met her eyes. I know you've had people claim protection as a cover for control. I need you to understand that this was different. How do I know that? Because everything else I've done, Louise, every single thing, you can trace it. You can look at it from every angle. Did any of it limit you? Did any of it make you smaller? Did any of it cost you something you hadn't agreed to give? She was silent. Her hands were still on the table, still trembling faintly. The coat, he said, the book, the compass, the map, the seeds. He listed them quietly, not as ammunition but as evidence. Did any of it ever ask you to be less than what you are? She stared at him and felt the question hit somewhere deep and unguarded. No, she admitted. That's because keeping you here was never my intention. When I gave you a compass, Louise, I was telling you that you could go, that you had a direction, that you were free. His jaw worked. I kept Bourne's visit from you. That was wrong and I own it. But I was not working for him. I was never working for him. I have been working every day since I met you to make sure that when you look around at your life, you see something worth staying for. The room was very quiet. Outside, a mockingbird started up somewhere, filling the silence with borrowed songs. Louise picked up the letter. She read it again, slowly this time, with everything Harlan had just said alongside it. She looked at the date Bourne claimed to have made the arrangement, October. Before she had arrived, which meant before any of the gifts, before any of it. She looked at the language, the way Bourne wrote, self-important and proprietary, the language of a man who had been refused and was rewriting the story so he hadn't been. She had read enough difficult documents in her life to know when something had been fabricated from wounded pride. She set the letter down. She looked at Harlan. Bourne is coming in the spring, she said. His letter to me said he'd be here with legal documentation. Harlan nodded. I know. I heard from a man in Dalton Creek that he was making preparations. He said it steadily, not as a confession, but as information shared between partners. I've been in correspondence with a lawyer in San Antonio about the validity of that debt, about whether it can be enforced. Louise stared at him. You've been, for 2 months, he said, since I found out he'd actually written to you. You didn't tell me that either. I didn't want to alarm you before I had something useful to say. He looked at her with those steady dark eyes. The lawyer says the debt, as it stands, is on shaky legal ground. That the assignment from the original lender to Bourne was improperly documented. That if you challenge it, you may well win. She absorbed this. The morning light was fuller now, the kitchen warming slightly as the sun climbed. You hired a lawyer, she said slowly, for a problem that was mine and didn't involve you. It does involve me, he said quietly. You involve me, Louise. Everything about you involves me. She felt that land somewhere in the middle of her chest and stay there. Why didn't you just tell me, she asked, and the question came from somewhere honest and a little raw. Why did you always have to find things out and fix things and leave them at my door without a note? Because, he said, and for the first time she saw something like vulnerability in his face, real vulnerability, the kind that doesn't have a strategy behind it. You made it clear from the beginning that you didn't need anything, that you were fine, that you managed. And I could see that was true, and I could also see what it was costing you to always be fine. He paused. I didn't want to make you feel like a project or a charity case. I wanted, he stopped. What? She asked. I wanted you to have things. Good things, without them having a price. He exhaled. I suppose I didn't think enough about whether keeping quiet was its own kind of price. Louise stood up from the table. She walked to the window and stood looking out at the bare January landscape, the dry grass, the distant hills, the enormous Texas sky that she had hated at first for its vastness and had grown, over these months, to need in the way you need things that remind you how small your troubles actually are. I grew up watching my father give everything he had to people who didn't deserve it, she said to the window. And I watched those people take and never once think about what it cost him. I decided a long time ago that I would never put myself in a position where another person's choices could undo me. She turned around and looked at him. I have spent my entire adult life making sure I owe nothing and need nothing and trust no one any further than I can see them. I know, he said, And then you kept leaving things on my windowsill, she said, and despite herself, despite everything, something in her voice gave way at the edges. Things that I never asked for and never expected. Things that understood me in ways I hadn't given anyone enough information to understand me. She pressed her lips together. That is a very specific kind of terrifying, Harlan. I know that too, he said softly. She looked at him for a long time. At the man who had sat across from her at a worn table and paid attention in a way that had, grain by grain, shifted the ground beneath everything she thought she knew about herself and what she needed. The letter is a lie, she said. Yes. Bourne wrote it to make himself feel better about being turned down. That's what I believe. And the lawyer in San Antonio is someone I trust. Name's Franklin Webb. He's been handling land and debt cases since 1872. He knows the territory. Harlan reached into his coat and produced a folded document. He sent this 2 days ago, his formal assessment of your case. She crossed the room and took it. Read it carefully, the way she read everything with full attention, with the part of her mind that did not allow sentiment to color analysis. The legal reasoning was sound. The assignment of debt from the original lender to Cletus Bourne was missing a required recorded acknowledgement that Texas law had required since 1876. The debt, as documented, could not be legally enforced against Louise Grayson in a Texas court. She looked up from the document. Her eyes were very bright and her jaw was very tight, and she said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you." He looked at her across the table. "I mean it," she said. "I know I say it too stiffly sometimes. I mean it fully. Thank you." "You don't owe me." "I know I don't," she said. "That's exactly why I want to say it, because you gave it without making me owe you, and so the thanks can be exactly what it is, just thanks. Nothing else required." He smiled then. She had seen him smile before, small and private, but this was fuller. It reached all the way through his expression and changed his whole face, made him look younger and more open and very, very beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they are exactly what they appear to be. She sat back down at the table, across from him, and something between them settled, like sediment in disturbed water, slowly finding its proper place. "Bourne still has to be dealt with," she said practically, because she was always going to be practical first. It was too deep in her to excise it, and she had stopped wanting to. "He does," Harlan agreed, practical and kind. "I want to be part of that. I want to be in the room when it happens. I wouldn't have it any other way. And I want to write to Franklin Webb myself, introduce myself to my own lawyer. I'll give you his address." "Good." She folded the document. "And Harlan," she stopped, started again. "The things you've been giving me, I need you to know that she found the words slowly, the way you find footing on unfamiliar ground. They mattered, each one. More than I let show, which was a great deal." He watched her with that same quiet intensity that had unsettled her from the beginning and now felt, improbably and completely, like the safest place she had ever been. "I know," he said simply. She laughed, a short, startled sound that surprised them both, because Louise Grayson did not laugh easily or often. "You are remarkably unruffled by most things," she said. "I've been ruffled plenty," he said. "Mostly by you." There it was between them. Not a proposal, not a declaration, but the clear and unmistakable arrival of something that had been moving toward this point for months. Something that had grown in the space between a coat on a peg and a compass in a cedar box, and a lawyer's letter in a man's coat pocket. Something built, grain by grain, from the peculiar and radical act of paying attention to a person who had made herself very difficult to see. Cletus Bourne arrived in Red Creek on a Tuesday in early April, riding a good horse and accompanied by a man who carried a document case, and wore the expression of a professional who knew the job he was doing was unpleasant, but had made his peace with that. Louise was in the general store when she saw them ride past the window. She recognized Bourne from the way she recognized certain types of men, something in the set of the shoulders, the proprietary angle of the head, the look of a person who has never seriously questioned his right to what he's after. She had met men like this before. She had learned to read them the way other people read weather. She set down the bolt of fabric she had been examining, and she walked to the hotel where Bourne and his associate had, she correctly assumed, already taken rooms. Harlan was already there. She didn't know how he had known, but she was beginning to understand that Harlan Keller had a network of awareness about things that mattered to him, and she had become something that mattered to him in the most comprehensive possible way. He was standing just inside the hotel lobby, speaking with the desk clerk, and when he saw her come through the door, something in his posture changed, not relief exactly, but the particular settling that happens when the people who need to be in the same place are finally in the same place. "He's in room 3, Harlan said quietly. "His associate has the documents." "I have our documents," Louise said. Franklin Webb had sent, in addition to his legal assessment, a formal letter to be presented to Bourne directly, outlining the deficiency in the debt assignment and the legal exposure Bourne faced if he attempted to pursue the matter in a Texas court. She was holding that letter in her hand. She had been carrying it in her coat pocket for 3 days like a compass of a different kind. "Do you want me with you?" Harlan asked. She thought about this. A year ago, 6 months ago, she would have said no. Reflexively, absolutely, without examination. She did this alone, she did everything alone, that was simply the rule. "Yes," she said. He nodded once, and his expression held something careful and warm that she was learning to recognize as his version of joy. The meeting with Bourne was brief, and to his visible fury decisive. Louise sat across from him in the hotel's small parlor and placed Franklin Webb's letter on the table between them with the same composure she brought to Edna's bookkeeping, clean, precise, without performance. She explained the legal deficiency in his claim. She named the statute. She named the consequence. She offered him the opportunity to withdraw, formally, and in writing, before the matter became one for the courts. Bourne was a man who was accustomed to people without resources. He was not accustomed to Louise Grayson. He tried several approaches: authority, condescension, an attempt to invoke her father's name in a way designed to land as guilt, and each one failed to find purchase because she was not, as he had calculated, a woman who could be destabilized by the tools he usually used. His associate reviewed the Webb letter, conferred with Bourne in a whispered exchange in the corner, and returned to the table with the look of a man who is about to have an honest conversation with his employer. Bourne left Red Creek the following morning without the debt collection he had come for. He left behind a formal withdrawal of the claim, witnessed by the Red Creek hotel clerk, and signed with the bad grace of a man doing the right thing for the wrong reasons, which was still, as far as Louise Grayson was concerned, sufficient. She stood on the main street and watched his wagon pull away and felt, for the first time in longer than she could precisely locate, the sensation of a weight leaving her body that she had become so accustomed to carrying that she had forgotten it was separate from herself. Harlan was beside her, not touching. He had always been careful about that, always made sure that proximity was her choice, and not something he engineered, but close. Solid and warm in the early April air. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he agreed. She turned to look at him. The Texas spring morning was brilliant around them, the light that only exists in that particular place and season, full and clear and somehow both soft and sharp at once, and Harlan Keller was standing in it with his hat in his hand and his eyes on her face, and Louise thought, with a clarity that arrived so suddenly it almost took her breath, "I love this man." She had known it was coming. She had been watching it approach for months, the way you can see a storm front building on the horizon and know it will reach you, and also know there is no point in running because it will reach you. She had tried to prepare herself. She had tried to build the appropriate response, the measured response, the response that kept her safe. She had not, it turned out, been able to do it, not with this particular man. Not with the coat and the Tennyson and the compass and the lawyer's letter and the quiet impossibility of his patience. "Harlan," she said. He looked at her. "I love you," she said, plainly, directly. Because she had never, in her life, been able to do the important things any other way. I think I have been falling in love with you since October, and I have spent the entire time since then trying to talk myself out of it, and I've failed comprehensively." He was very still for a moment. Then something in him broke open. That was the only phrase for it. A breaking open, like a door that's been shut against weather swinging wide. And the smile that crossed his face was unlike anything she had seen from him before. Full and young and completely unguarded. "Louise," he said, and her name in his mouth was the same thing it had always been, which was a declaration disguised as a syllable. "I have been in love with you since the evening you sat down across from me without being invited and told me you hadn't asked for the coat," he exhaled. "Nobody has ever told me off and completely undone me at the same time before." She laughed again, that startled, free sound. "I wasn't telling you off. You were a little, maybe a little." She looked at him, felt the April light on her face and the solid ground of Red Creek, Texas beneath her feet, and the extraordinary, terrifying, real fact of this man in front of her. "Now what?" she asked. He reached into his pocket and he brought out, small and folded, a piece of paper. He held it out to her. She took it and opened it. It was a note in his handwriting, not formal, just words set down in the way he spoke. It said, "I have been saving this for when you were ready. Whenever that is. I mean every word." Below the note was a single sentence. It said, "Will you do me the honor of being my wife?" She looked up at him. He was watching her with an expression that was, for the first time in all the months she had known him, completely without composure, completely open, completely at her mercy. Everything he was laid out and visible and waiting. "You wrote this down," she said, and she heard how her voice had changed, softened into something she hadn't known she was still capable of. "I wasn't sure I'd be able to say it right," he admitted. "Words come harder for me than most things." She folded the paper very carefully and put it in her coat pocket, beside the now unnecessary legal letter, beside the compass she still carried every day. "Yes," she said. He closed his eyes briefly, as if receiving something he had been afraid would not arrive. Then he opened them and he was looking at her, and the whole morning was full of light, and she crossed the single step between them, and he reached out and took both her hands in his, and they stood in the middle of Red Creek's Main Street in the April sun like two people who have finally, after a very long time, arrived somewhere they intended to be. They were married in June. It was not a large wedding. Neither of them wanted that. Edna Prout stood for Louise, and Harlan's nearest neighbor and friend, a big-shouldered man named Thomas Cade who ran the Cade spread to the north, stood for Harlan. The Red Creek Church still had its peeling paint on the south wall, but someone Louise suspected Harlan had arranged it without mentioning it, had placed a row of wildflowers along the front pew, the same variety as the seeds he had given her, which had bloomed spectacularly in the patch beside the boarding house steps, and which she had spent the spring watching with a ferocious and private joy. The preacher was a man named Elias Dowd who took his work seriously and performed the ceremony without embellishment, but also without hurry, as if he understood that certain things should not be rushed. When he asked if Louise Grayson took Harlan Keller to be her lawful wedded husband, she said yes with a conviction that the people in the small church felt settle over them like a change in weather. When Harlan said his vows, he looked at her the whole time, not at the preacher, not at the book, not at anything else, just at her. She moved to the K-Bar Ranch the following week. She had expected the transition to feel difficult. She was a woman of profound self-sufficiency who had never truly shared space with another person as an adult. But it felt instead like the strange and specific ease of fitting something into a space that had always been shaped for it. The ranch needed work, not because Harlan had neglected it, but because it had always been one person's operation, and the addition of another person with ideas and energy, and an eye for what could be improved, was something it responded to immediately. She began with the garden, establishing a proper kitchen garden that would supplement their larder through the year, applying the same systematic thinking she had brought to Edna's accounts. She put up preserves in July. She kept careful records. She learned the rhythms of the cattle operation, and eventually, over the summer, began to ride with Harlan to check the herd, which he had not expected, and which she could tell pleased him in the quietly proprietary way that good surprises pleased him. They talked in the evenings. This was, perhaps, the thing she had not anticipated, how much they would talk, how different it was from the careful parceling out of information she had managed in all her previous relationships with people. Harlan was not a man who needed silence to be filled, but he was also not a man who left silence unfilled when filling it meant knowing her better. He asked questions that were not intrusive. They were questions about what she thought, about what she wanted, about the specific shape of her hopes and her opinions. He listened to the answers with the same unhurried attention he brought to everything. She found herself, over the long summer evenings on the porch of the K-Bar house, talking about her father in a way she had not talked about him since the funeral. About the man he had been, his particular kindness, his weakness for debt, the way he could fix any mechanical thing but couldn't navigate the financial world that was always threatening to close around him. She talked about Ohio in a way that acknowledged it as lost without requiring her to grieve it still. She talked about what she wanted, which she had not let herself want clearly for so long that articulating it was like exercising a muscle she had forgotten she had. Harlan, in return, told her about his brother James, who had died in 1878 of the same fever that was moving through the territory, who had been the more sociable of the two of them, who had planned to come out to Texas and help build the ranch, and whose absence had left Harlan building it alone with a quietness that had hardened over the years into the particular self-sufficiency she had recognized on first meeting him because it mirrored her own. "We're the same," she said once, on a September evening when the air was beginning to sharpen toward autumn. "In the important ways," he agreed, "and different in the useful ones," she said, which made him smile. He continued to give her things. She had wondered, privately, if the giving would stop once the need to demonstrate himself had been satisfied by her acceptance. She had half expected it, the way courtship behaviors sometimes dissolved once courtship was over. It did not stop. It changed in character, became less about practical comfort and more about joy, but it continued with the same steady, attention-born consistency. He found things that delighted her specifically, that could only have occurred to a person who had been paying the kind of attention that most people gave to things they considered truly important. A star chart, because she had mentioned once that her father had known the constellations and had named them for her on summer nights, and she had lost the names gradually over the years. He got her a good one from a bookseller in San Antonio, with the constellations labeled in both their Latin and their common names, and she spent 3 evenings in October relearning them, sitting on the porch in the cooling night air, and she told Harlan the names of each one she found, and he listened. Seeds for a particular variety of apple tree, the variety used in the preserves that had been her father's favorite. He had found the source, had corresponded with a nursery in East Texas, had ordered 2 saplings that arrived in the fall and which they planted together on the south side of the house, where they would get the most sun. It would be years before they bore fruit, and both of them understood this. And there was something about that understanding, the planting of a thing neither of them would see bear fruit for years, that felt like a statement of faith so profound she couldn't say it aloud. She found in the mornings that she had begun to do the same. Not deliberately, it arose naturally, the way things do when you have been watching a person long enough to know what they need. She learned that Harlan woke before dawn and sat with his coffee and the silence before the day began, and she learned to let that silence be his, to not fill it, to understand it as necessary to him the way some people needed prayer or music. She learned that the work of the ranch that wore on him most was the accounting, not because he couldn't do it, but because numbers had never sat comfortably in his mind. And she took it over without drama, simply presenting him, 1 month, with the finished ledger and the observation that she had been running it, and it seemed to be going well. She learned that he liked music but had no instrument and never spoke of it. She arranged, through a correspondence with Edna that took 3 months, the acquisition of a second-hand fiddle that had belonged to a traveling musician who had left it at the boarding house in lieu of payment. She set it on the table one evening without comment and waited. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at her. "You remembered," he said. "You mentioned it once, that your mother played." He picked it up and held it the way you hold something from another life carefully, with a grief that is also a kind of gratitude. He played for her that night, rough and unpracticed, a melody she didn't recognize but felt instinctively was real, and she sat across from him in the firelight and thought, "This is what it is to know someone and be known. This is the thing I thought I was protecting myself from." She had been wrong about what she was protecting herself from. She had been protecting herself from loss, and she had failed to understand that the only way to avoid loss is to avoid everything, and everything includes this: the firelight, the fiddle, the man across from her who had handed her a compass and meant, "You are free. You are always free, and you are also, if you want it, home." In the spring of 1882, Louise told Harlan she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen in the morning with her usual directness, no staging, no ceremony, just the fact laid between them. He sat down very suddenly, which made her laugh. "Sit down before you're already sitting," she said. He looked up at her from the chair with an expression she had never seen on his face before, unguarded in a new way, young in a new way, holding something so large it seemed barely containable. "Louise," he said. "I know," she said. He stood up again and came to her, and held her with the particular gentleness he reserved for things he was afraid of losing, and she let herself be held, which she could do now, which was something she had learned to do, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt his heartbeat and the solid warmth of the man she had refused to need, and had needed anyway, completely and without reservation. Their son was born in October, during a spell of weather so perfect it seemed designed for the occasion, the autumn light pouring in through the windows, the air cool and clean, the smell of the K-Bar ranch in the fall, which was grass and wood smoke, and the particular dusty sweetness of the country. Edna Prout came out from town to help, and Thomas Cade rode over with his wife Margaret, who had midwife experience, and who managed the whole thing with the calm efficiency of a woman who understood that birth, like most things, was best approached practically. They named him James for Harlan's brother. It was Louise who suggested it, and when she did, Harlan looked at her for a long moment with something in his face that made her understand, fully and finally, that she had gotten this right. James Keller arrived into the world making an extraordinary amount of noise for a person of his size, which Edna said was a good sign, and which Harlan took as a personal characteristic so consistent with his nature that he laughed out loud, a real, full laugh that Louise stored in her memory like a bright coin. He held his son. He was careful about it the way he was careful about things he loved, and he looked at the baby in his arms with an expression that Louise memorized, that she still, years later, could recall with complete precision, the exact quality of that morning light, the exact way he looked. "Hello, James," he said quietly. The baby opened his eyes, fixed Harlan with the unfocused, ancient gaze of the newborn. Louise watched them from the bed and felt something in her that had been missing for years, something that she had packed up and put away after her father died, something she had convinced herself she could manage without settle back into its proper place. It felt like arriving, not just to a place, but to a self she had been traveling toward without knowing it. The years that followed were not without difficulty. They were working ranchers in 1880s Texas, and difficulty was simply the weather in which life occurred. But they were full in a way that Louise, in her years of careful self-sufficiency, had not allowed herself to anticipate. The K-Bar grew. Harlan's reputation in the territory grew with it. He was known as a fair dealer, an honest man, someone whose word meant what it said. Louise built, gradually and with enormous satisfaction, a parallel reputation as a person whose mind you wanted on any problem involving numbers, accounting, or the logical analysis of a difficult situation. She worked with Edna occasionally, still, helping to set the boarding house finances on a better footing, and eventually helped two other business owners in Red Creek establish better bookkeeping practices, which she charged a modest fee for and which was, in 1882, quite an unusual professional activity for a woman in West Texas. A fact she was aware of and considered nobody's business but her own and Harlan's. Harlan's response to her professional ambitions, consistent with everything she had come to know about him, was to be straightforwardly interested and supportive. He drove her into town when she had appointments. He asked good questions about the work. He never once suggested that it was unusual or inappropriate. This was such a simple and complete acceptance that she occasionally had to sit with it for a while before she could receive it properly. The gifts continued. He never stopped. She had come to understand this as simply part of who he was, the careful watching, the noticing, the particular delight he took in finding the thing that was right rather than the thing that was easy or expensive. Years into their marriage, he could still surprise her. A new pair of leather-covered account books with her initials pressed into the cover, because he had seen her old ones wearing out. A preserved specimen of a native Texas wildflower, beautifully pressed and mounted, because she had once mentioned that she wished she could capture what the spring prairie looked like. A letter, 1 year for her birthday, that was simply a letter. His handwriting, his words, telling her specifically and without performance what the years with her had meant to him, the particular ways she had changed his life, the specific things about her that he loved. She read that letter 4 times and then she put it in the cedar box with the compass. She wrote him one back. It took her a week because she was meticulous even with love letters, because she wanted every word to be right. When he read it, he said nothing for a long time. He was sitting at the kitchen table and she was across the room, and when he finally looked up, his eyes were bright and he said, "You didn't ask for any of this either, you know." She looked at him. "You didn't come here looking for a life," he said. "You came here getting by and you made this." He gestured at the house at the window where the 2 young apple trees were visible in the yard at the sounds of James playing somewhere outside. "You made all of this. I just tried to keep up with you." She crossed the room and she sat beside him at the table, very close, the way she had learned to sit beside this man without the careful maintenance of distance that had once been her default. "No," she said. "We made it." He covered her hand with his, that was all. They were still sitting that way when James came running in from outside, 3 years old and absolutely filthy and radiant with the particular joy of a child who has been doing something with dirt that he is not supposed to be doing with dirt. And they both looked at him and then at each other with the helpless, exhausted, complete love of parents. And the kitchen was full of noise and laughter, and the excellent ordinary chaos of a life that was, in every sense that mattered, whole. In 1884, Louise had their second child, a girl this time, born in July, into the full heat of a Texas summer that was not the peaceful autumn weather James had arrived in. This one was quicker and quieter, arriving with the decisive efficiency of a person who had decided on the timing and was proceeding on schedule. They named her Clara, for Louise's mother, which was Louise's suggestion, and which she offered with the particular courage that comes from being safe enough to be sentimental. Clara Keller came into the world with her father's dark eyes and her mother's expression of focused self-possession, and she would grow up as the beloved terror of the K-Bar Ranch, capable of managing cattle before she was 7 and capable of reducing her older brother to incoherence in any argument by the age of 8. And Harlan regarded this with an affection so deep it made Louise's chest ache. The apple trees bore fruit for the first time in the fall of 1886, 6 years after Harlan had planted the saplings on the south side of the house. Louise picked the first apples on a morning when the light was the same extraordinary quality it had been on the day she had realized she loved him, and she brought a basket of them inside and she made preserves. She put the first jar on the table at supper and said nothing, and Harlan looked at it and then looked at her across the table. Their son on one side, their daughter on the other, the K-Bar ranch solid and real around them, the years of it in every wall and floorboard and the garden visible through the window. He smiled at her. The full smile, the real one, the one that reached everywhere. She smiled back. There had been a time when Louise Grayson had believed that needing nothing was the same as being free. She had organized her entire life around that belief, had packed it into a single canvas bag, and carried it across Texas, and used it to keep the world at a careful, managed distance. She had believed that freedom was about what you didn't need, and what you didn't owe, and what you didn't risk. She understood now that freedom was something else entirely. It was the ability to receive something with open hands. It was the capacity to let a person know you, truly, fully, in the imperfect and particular reality of what you were, without being diminished by it. It was the compass that said, you can always find where you are, you can go, and the extraordinary, irreversible discovery that when you could go and you chose to stay, staying was the freest thing in the world. She had asked for nothing, and Harlan Keller, who was steady and careful and impossible, who had paid more attention to her than any person ever had spent every day since he met her finding new things to give her. Not things she had asked for, things she hadn't known she needed. The map of Ohio River Valley that reminded her where she came from, the compass that told her she was free, the lawyer's letter that cleared the debt that wasn't even legally hers to carry, the fiddle that brought his brother's memory back into a house that had been too quiet, the apple trees that required 6 years to bear fruit and were worth every winter of waiting. He had given her, grain by grain, the remarkable gift of being known. And she had given him, in return, the same, had learned to read him the way she read her ledgers, precisely and completely, had learned what he needed before he knew he needed it, had made the K-Bar into something that was not just his endurance project but their built life, their made thing. James was 11, and Clara was 8 in the summer of 1892, when Louise stood on the porch of the K-Bar house on an evening in June, and watched her husband ride in from the far pasture, just the way she had watched him 100 evenings since they had been married. He sat well on a horse, the way he did everything without showiness, just the quiet competence of a man who had learned his work thoroughly. The evening light was behind him, and the ranch was at its summer best, the grass holding onto green longer than it usually did because of a wet May, and the children were somewhere nearby making the ordinary noise of children in summer. He came up to the porch and dismounted and handed off the horse to the young ranch hand they employed now, a good-natured boy from San Antonio named Eli, and came up the porch steps and stopped beside her, and they stood together looking out at the land that was theirs. The light was doing what it did in that part of Texas at that hour, going warm and sideways, making everything look like something you'd want to keep. "Good day," she asked. "Good day," he said. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small paper parcel, set it on the porch railing beside her. She looked at it. "What is this?" "Open it." She unwrapped it. Inside was a small glass bottle, sealed with wax, containing a dark liquid that smelled, when she held it close, of ink. Very specific, very particular, the same ink her father used to use. She recognized it the way you recognize things that belong to another time, not with thought but with the body, a physical recognition. "How?" she said. "Took some finding," he said, with the understatement that characterized everything he did that required significant effort. She held the bottle and felt the ache of it, the good ache, the kind that means something you thought was gone has returned, even briefly, even partially, even just as a smell in a small glass bottle on a June evening. "You are ridiculous," she said, which was the highest compliment in her private vocabulary, and he knew it. "I know," he said, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the K-Bar evening settled around them, full of children's voices and birdsong and the long, golden, entirely sufficient light of everything they had made together. She had asked for nothing. He had spent every day finding new things to give her. She had stopped being afraid of it. She had learned slowly, with the full difficulty of a person who had built very good walls for very good reasons, that being given something by a person who asked nothing in return was not a trap. That love, when it was real, did not arrive as a transaction or a claim or a debt you couldn't see the terms of. That the things worth having were the things that arrived with open hands and no invoice. She had asked for nothing, and she had received in return everything that mattered: this man, this land, these children, this life that was hers in a way that no legal document could touch and no Cletus born could collect, because it was built of mornings and evenings and conversations and small kindnesses and a compass and 2 apple trees and a fiddle played badly and better, and the continuous, daily, inexhaustible act of 2 people choosing to know each other. She turned her face up to his, and he looked down at her, and the Texas evening was enormous around them, and she thought, clearly and without defense, for the 100th time, "I love this man. I love him completely. I am grateful that I was not able to talk myself out of it." "Stay with me," she said, not because she thought he would leave, she knew he wouldn't, with the certainty she knew the compass always pointed north, but because she wanted to say it, wanted to offer it, wanted him to know that after everything her yes was still daily, still deliberate, still absolutely free. He held her closer. His answer was not in words, because some answers are too large for words, but she felt it in the solid, breathing warmth of him, and in the evening light over the land they had built together, and in the sound of their children somewhere nearby, James shouting about something and Clara's authoritative response, the ordinary and extraordinary music of everything they had made. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. The sun went down over Red Creek, Texas, and the K-Bar Ranch held its quiet and its abundance, and Louise Grayson, Louise Keller, stood on her porch with her husband's arm around her and felt, with the whole of herself, the precise and irreplaceable sensation of being exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because she had asked for it, because she had been, against all her considerable resistance, found.